DraftScience video regarding pyrrho, actually. So he made some commentary about my style. He wants to discuss physics, but he doesn't think blah 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 because I don't whatever the way he does. And I agree, we don't have compatible styles. I think when somebody raises an issue, you have to respond to it, and he doesn't. When you make a counter argument, you have to do something with the counter argument. You can't just pretend the counter argument wasn't made, and that's Pyrrho's style in my characterization. So he can use whatever characterizations he wants to regarding my willingness to deal with real subjects. He said something like, I'm not willing to indulge his theories or whatever, as if I'm not giving it common respect or something, and I think I am. I'm just saying that I've made counter arguments why your theory doesn't work. Your theory that inanimate objects feel, that microtubules are neurons. I've pointed out why this can't be possible, that what we know about evolution already demonstrates this couldn't happen in reality. If it were true, there would be a different world than there is now. Yeah, very different. If brains could be that big, yeah, that's how big they'd be. That's how evolution works. If it could do it simpler, it would do it simpler. It finds a way, as the movie line goes. It tends to. And you have to explain why it didn't tend to. Why we have complex, highly energy-consuming functions, tools, when we could have highly efficient, why? Why would nature, if it had the faculty, if it had the ability, why wouldn't it use it? Well, I don't want to make. I mean, look, see, I'm stuck here making counter arguments I've already made to your arguments in defense of a proposition that isn't true. I listen to your theory, unlike you who don't even listen. So in the video, he actually says he can't even properly characterize the events at whatever the place was called. That place, the whatever stack exchange. Didn't even know that I posted the question, and he could just deal with the question, right? It wasn't that complex. It's just a paragraph. Could have dealt with it if he wants to discuss physics, if he sincerely wants to discuss physics. And I've made these arguments before, and he has no response to them. I mean, I point out that here you're stuck with a circumstance where the only way you can see a photon is it has to interact with something. And the smallest thing it can interact with, technically, is an electron. The only thing, there's nothing in between, let's say, that we can detect. I mean, they can't detect a quark by itself. They can only surmise its existence. So the only thing we can't see anything between photon and electron. We can't detect anything in between there, size-wise. So if there's something in between there, we can't detect it. We have no mechanism to see it. No hardware to watch it maneuver. But anyway, and the only way we see photons is we have to see where they go. We can't see them go somewhere. We can only see them by them arriving somewhere, affecting something, being connected to it, and then readmitting or going somewhere else in some different form. But I'm just saying it has to have an interaction, and the interaction is going to be decisive in terms of it's not going to be a small interaction, it's going to be a real interaction to see anything, because photons are small. Alright, So, I mean, for one to influence something, obviously the influence has to be almost, you have to use up the entire photon to create the effect of the interaction. Which goes with my whole theory of this, little fish enters big school of fish, but it's always the little fish in the big school of fish until it leaves the big school of fish. There's no eating allowed. This conservation concept is probably something we can agree on, maybe. So whatever this universe is made out of, it's got to be conserved. Whether you call it information, which I really hate. Patterns, they're patterns. It's not information. There's patterns. And patterns are merely configurations of energy. So anyway, so yeah, I'd like to have a conversation about the fact that I've made the argument to Pyrrho in the past that when we are faced with the problem like the two-slit experiment, are these other experiments that are being used to say, look, light must be a wave. If you apply a little bit of reasoning to the problem, you can sort of figure out that, well, wait a minute. The light isn't interacting with matter, it's interacting with nuclear particles. And the light, we can sort of know just from experience with it, it doesn't tend to do anything except go from point A to point B in a straight line, unless something forces it to do something else, unless something applies influence in some substantial way, and that it is the electron, the receiver, the thing we're looking at and watching to see light. We see light by watching it affect electrons. As we all know, a photon happened, is that it moves an electron, it changes an electron, its energy level, or its emission of another photon. But that's how we see it. And we know that these electrons are in atoms that we already know are jiggling, Brownian motion, and that the bits inside are likely jiggling, and that they all have jiggling frequencies, and that these frequencies is the creation of this sine wave, which is the wave, right? So it seems pretty obvious that if we're going to say something is giving a wave character to the photon's travel, it would be the thing that's influencing it, the electrons, that have the wave character, that have the cycles, the orbital cycles. And again, it's a sine wave. Anytime you create a clock, a cycle, you create a sine wave of frequency. Fact. The orbit of the Earth, it's just this cycle. It's a frequency. It could be plotted as a sine wave. Yeah, and that the universe is a precision instrument. I don't know if somebody else has ever said that, but you could put that one in quotes, let's say. The universe is a precision instrument. There's no mess thing. There's no just this, it's every little tiny bit has to be accounted for. Every little directional push, every influence has a source, and it all has to be accounted for. All right, I didn't want to get into background because I want Pyrrho. Let's have a conversation about light. Let's talk about my theory. It's right here. I asked the question: photon is just two or more rudimentary elements, quantons, traveling in a directional vector separated by a constant distance and having an orientation of polarization. I was thinking about polarization. Well, anyway, all wavelengths of radiation are made of the same stuff, and it's just a period between constituent elements that defines distinction. So this is a photon is half a photons, two half photons, two quantons I'm calling them, two fundamental quanta particles separated by a distance moving the same vector. That's the theory. And why can't this theory be correct? And again, I think I have explained, and I've at least cast some doubt on the traditional notions regarding what the two-slit phenomenon represents, in the sense that I've pointed out that the light projected on the two slits is already suspect because of the aperture that's used to expand it, and that itself creates diffraction. So you're throwing diffracted light at two slits and then looking at the diffraction pattern created by the two slits, which gives reason for pause in one's thinking. And then I've pointed out that the two slits really create a circumstance where the most intense light is now more likely to hit a surface, where in a single slit it's less likely. And that the diffraction pattern for the single slit and the double slit is the same diffraction pattern, at least it has the same wave function. And the difference is in the single slit it's 9 times less intense, which might have something to do with the fact that there's less intense light that's hitting the surfaces, where in the two slit the most intense light is hitting the surfaces. I think that's a reasonable explanation, but I get nothing in return. I make the argument, and there's no counter argument, no explanation why that's useless. That interpretation has no meaning, beyond them saying something like that, or they'll just say Feynman says, and that's the end of the conference. Quantum mechanics is the most proven theory in the history of man. Well, again, the wave function, the existence of a periodic wave influence is not being disputed. What's being disputed is the cause, the source of it. Where is it? And I'm saying it's in the matter. It's not in the photon. All right. So there's so much I could go into. Whoa. Well, I'll have to do that later. And such. Back. I think. Really deaf today, and allergies or something too. So anyway, I'm just complaining. So anyway, I think I was something about the clockwork of the universe, and I just wanted to get to this energy thing, because it's sort of, this is just like one of these bigger picture kind of things, like the ultimate theory, is that the whole universe is energy. It's energy. It's like the school of fish analogy, except understanding that none of the fish have any directional will, and everything they do has to be forced on them. Some other thing has to knock them into association with each other. So if there was a school of fish, there had to be a constant pressure to keep them together, to keep them from just shooting out in all kinds of directions. There have to be something that knocked them in to keep them contained. And that's how the universe functions, is everything's being forced into associations with each other. And that's really energy. So most energy is in this form of this gravity. And we don't think of it that way because, you know, it's not renewable, in a sense that, you know, gravity is a one-way kind of energy ticket. You have to stay where you end up to gain anything from the gravity, you know. So you can gain from the velocity to get from space to the Earth. You can gain some energy, but you can't leave, because leaving is going to require you to expend some sort of energy. But that's the energy cannot be created or destroyed thing, and the whole illusion of what energy is just this directional thing. You know, it's just this, and it's any imbalance in that direction. So it's like visible light is a tiny part of the spectrum of photons, and it's like light itself, that is, half of photons are gravity, gravitons are quantons. Without a frequency is most energy. Most energy is invisible to us because it doesn't have a frequency. But that's the form that most of the moving bits are in, and it's only a tiny percentage of the energy of the universe that is visible as photons, and then only a tiny percentage of that that's visible as light. Visible light. Anyway, well, that's the deeper subject. So anyway, I just wanted to say that a little bit of the history of this light theory. So this light thing I was arguing before I did the unification thing, did the gravity thing, did the directional aerokinetic thing. I always had, I was always hostile to this description of the electromagnetic spectrum. Whenever I thought about photons or light or radiation, it never made any sense that the particle could have frequency, wavelength. So I was always thinking of, beginning and ending, head, tail, and it always seemed kind of irrelevant what's in between. The head and the tail is the only part that matters. It's this period, this frequency thing. And so it always seemed to me intuitive, reasonable to perceive light or photons or radiation, anything at a frequency, as something that has a beginning and an end, two parts, and like I said, this irrelevancy in between. So what do I want to say about that? So that predated any of the rest of this theoretical stuff, was just this idea that it just made more sense for redshift and all these things to think about how this thing would be created by an atom, this thing called a photon. And it always seemed to me to make sense that it's created by throwing a first one and then throwing the tail. First you throw the head, then you throw the tail. So anyway, I was thinking about polarization too, and I was thinking of it as more of a possibility that polarization could be a representation of the how light gets imprecise. So you could say that unpolarized light is pure light in the sense that the head bit and the tail bit are perfectly aligned. And you could argue, I might argue, that polarization is when the head bit and the tail bit have a slight misalignment. The tail bit's a little bit off, a slightly different parallel vector, and that depending on the directionality of that parallel vector, sideways or this way or whatever way, that would be the definition of polarized light, would be a defect in the light, in the sense that the light is being broken, and that if it gets double polarized, right, it's got a defect going one way and you give it a defect going the other way, you would essentially break it as light, because now it couldn't be recognized for its period or its frequency anymore, because it's lost its clockworkness. The universe is that meticulous, in that there's a regularity to the movement of the atoms and a regularity of the movement of the interior nuclear bits, and it has to be on that cycle. The electron will be here when the first head of the photon gets there, and then it's going to cycle and cycle and cycle, and it has to be right here again when that tail shows up. And if it's off a little bit, it's not going to get captured by that electron, and all it will have is the head, and then it'll just expel the head. So there'll be a head and a tail loose, but they won't be at the same frequency. They won't have a frequency anymore. They might have a similar vector, but it won't be similar enough, I guess is the way to say it. Be enough parallel off. Like I said, if you're parallel in two directions, if you're one Planck distance off in both axes, that puts you on some sort of diagonal where you'll be recognized as a new head, not a tail, kind of a thing. Well, anyway, I think it is a viable place to do some hypothesizing. So I'll hypothesize. using that. This sort of explains the parallel line filtering and all that kind of stuff, so it does fit with that. But there's a lot of ways you can define this polarization. It could be the spin. There could be a spin. And spin could have something to do with whether there's whether the kinetic reaction is a complete directional change. If they're both spinning in opposite directions and they bounce, essentially they go through each other. There's a complete exchange of direction, and if they're spinning similarly, then they would both end up going in a new vector. Their directions would be combined. So that is a possibility, I suppose. Just another way to take this, another way to think about it. But anyway, it's just trying to establish this certain, there's nothing absolutely prohibitive. There's no fact, or in my opinion, in the question I did ask, what hard evidence supports this description, the wave-like element containing electrical and magnetic components? What hard evidence is there of a photon that has a magnetic or electrical component? And I would argue there is no hard evidence. There's just speculation, and I think more viable speculation would say that the material photon interact with has electrical and magnetic components. I think that's the more viable conversation. So anyway, I think just another side thing I was just thinking of, my imagination just played with, was I was thinking of vacuums. You create a vacuum by, let's say, having a cylinder, and you just keep pulling the stuff out. And I was thinking about the incredible pressure that's created, and the pressure is really the differential of the atmosphere outside the piston. So it's not the piston can't move because it can't move in this empty space. It's that it can't push. Okay, so it can't go it can't go in that direction because of the atmosphere behind it. So I was thinking that where a pump is pumping a vacuum, it gets hot, it gets it's really working when it's trying to pump that last bit of molecular bonding out of the space. But I was thinking too that it can't pump things like electrons. It can't pump things that aren't somehow gravitationally, mechanically, magnetism is gravity, electricity is gravity, everything is gravity. So I'm just saying, without that connection, it can't pull on something else. So if something's free of that, there wouldn't be any. It'd be very hard to pull it out. I'm just saying. So there's no way to really pump everything out. So, but what if you take that same pump and you put it in space, in a more complete vacuum? Would the cylinder have any problem going back and forth? So there's essentially a perfect vacuum on both sides. As perfect as we know of, an equal vacuum on each side of the cylinder. So would the cylinder just go back and forth freely? I think it's a legitimate question. I guess I would say yes, it must. And that the only thing making the piston having a hard time in our reality isn't air pressure per se. It's molecular pressure. It's the fact that we're trying to pull molecules away from each other. And that bond is strong. We're stretching the atoms. We're forcing the atoms to fill the space that we're trying to create. And the atoms do not wish to get bigger. And so they're the thing creating the resistance to what we're doing. Or looked at another way, is the pressure outside is much bigger than what we think of as air pressure. I mean, it's a much stronger pressure than the gravity pressure created, just by pushing on the matter itself. There is something in the bonding gravitational molecular pressure between those two sides, it still exists somehow, and that those molecules want to go, they're still bound to what's on the other side of the cylinder, I guess. There's a strong magnetic force or electrical force. Well, anyway, I have to think on that one some more, but it is interesting. It's a curious thing to think about. Just about how, whether it's the yin or the yang, whether it's the absence of pressure or the excessive pressure, which one is creating the resistance. Is it that you can't expand the empty space, or is it that you can't, is that the pressure of the gravity of the nuclear gravity is so strong that that's what's pushing, that's creating this resistance to movement of the cylinder, and that in space it would be equal, that would be equalized again, so the cylinder should move back and forth freely. Okay, something like that. So anyway, it's probably enough of a video. So yeah, I'm interested in the conversation, and I'm interested in real critiques, but I'm not interested in, you're just a flake, who are you, you don't have any badges, you don't have any authority, Feynman was a super cool person, blah 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 blah. I'm not interested in that shit. So unless you can make a reasoned argument, as I've made reasoned arguments against your microtubule theories and your parameciums or thinking theory and feeling theory and all that shit, I've made reasonable arguments that point out how this is a low probability bit of speculation, because there's nothing in the evidence indicating that that's happening. And I pointed that out. So anyway, till next time, and such.